All right, so we've been talking and almost kind of joking, but kind of not joking, how we want to kind of revisit all the Tarantino movies that I did those old videos on before because I felt like they need redid in some way. Like I didn't do them justice, especially Reservoir Dogs. Me talking about Reservoir Dogs before was kind of like just more of a I read the IMDb trivia video. So it's like I figured it'd be nice to do something that kind of focuses on the movie itself more. So since me and you have been revisiting so much Tarantino lately, videos and otherwise, we figured we would do this one. But the question was always, what would we do it with? And we kind of had the same question about The Usual Suspects. It's like, well, what would we do it with? What can you even compare that to? And then we were just kind of looking around recently, and these two got put together, and it was you that kind of explained to me, well, there's like, the gathering of criminals, and then there's the job that goes horribly wrong, and it's more or less told to us through the perspective of one or more of the criminals. And it's like the more you talked about it, the more it kind of fell into place. Like, all right, I can see this.
Yeah, the only difference is in one movie the crime is run. You're not sure who runs the crime till the very end, and in the other movie, it's run by Elaine's dad.
Yeah. Yes, the by all accounts insane Lawrence Tierney, who was apparently pretty close to the characters he played, from what I've been told. Uh, so, which which brings the authenticity of people like Joe all the more onto the screen.
Dude, I'm convinced Elaine's dad is just Joe Cabot.
like he lived, or
Like it was a prequel.
Yeah.
Like singing the song that George was singing pushed him to the point where he just decided to go into crime.
Wow, he built his crime empire quickly. he's like the same age.
I mean, did you see how much he intimidated Jerry and George? It probably wasn't hard. That means in my version of the universe, Nice Guy Eddie is Elaine's brother.
That'd be weird.
Yeah.
So I figure we'll just like sometimes we bounce around, sometimes we do one then the other. This is probably a case for we'll do one then the other, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And you said you're not as clear on The Usual Suspect. You said it'd been about a year since the last time you saw it.
I'm not as versed in it.
But hopefully we can get a conversation going of some kind there. I'm sure we can. It's The Usual Suspects. So, but I figure since it came first, chronologically, we would start with Reservoir Dogs.
Don't you mean Reservoir Dogs?
Yes. There's so many things involving this movie that we have just kind of said, whether it be quotes from the movie, like I've lost track of the number of times you have said, let's go get a taco after a conversation. Or there's the interviews where, like we said, we've noticed this weird thing that Tarantino would do in his old interviews where whenever he would say Reservoir Dogs, he would do it weirdly aggressively.
Mm-hmm.
He's just that
as much as we've done that, though, no one will ever be our random out of context hook lines, which is something else I watched the other day thanks to Netflix.
Yeah, we're those people that you hear about that annoy other people, to where we can pretty much have entire conversations based solely on movie quotes.
We could do that just based on hook quotes.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure we have.
Yeah, because we always joked we could probably get, I think I even mentioned this when I talked about Hook in a video when I said that me and you could basically we said it, we should try one day to go an entire day speaking to each other only in Hook quotes, because we could probably do it.
It helps that the movie's 2.5 hours.
And same for a lot of Tarantino movies, though this one is his shortest. I'm pretty sure. I think the closest,
if you don't count Death Proof.
Yeah, well, even Death Proof's longer than this if you're talking about the
oh, is it?
The regular cut, I guess you call it, rather than the Grindhouse cut.
Mm.
And this was his introduction to the world, since he's trying to, well, number one, my best friend's birthday is like incomplete, and he is basically trying to wipe it from existence, probably still to this day.
Mm-hmm.
So technically his introduction to the world was this, to the point that he, if I remember correctly, he sold his True Romance script in order to fund this. but this still came out before True Romance did. That's
Hmm.
that's how quickly it all came together. Because he just happened to know somebody that knew Harvey Keitel, of course. But because if to my understanding, Harvey Keitel's kind of all about that, where like he was especially into working with first time filmmakers, which is why he ended up in some you could call it weird shit, but you could also call it interesting shit throughout his career,
Is this where
especially in
Monkey
kind of that.
Trouble comes in?
But so as far as starting with Reservoir Dogs and talking about how it's his introduction to like the world, do you think it's appropriate or maybe a bit indulgent that the very first thing we hear in the very first Quentin Tarantino movie is Tarantino monologuing himself out of his own mouth? I do. I obviously I'm gonna really like that because it's like, what better way? Because his dialogue pretty much started its own thing. Like I've said many times before, he basically created his own genre by the time Pulp Fiction came out. And so it's like his dialogue has such that almost recognizable way about it that it's almost like it's almost comforting that we were brought into that world first by hearing his dialogue through his own voice. So we're hearing it, so it feels like it's so pure Tarantino when it's coming out, that it's coming straight from his mouth, and that's the very first thing we hear in the first scene of the first Tarantino movie. But yeah, and of course this it was also the start of something that Pulp Fiction got a lot of credit for, which was the idea of criminals just kind of having normal conversations before they went and committed a crime.
Hmm.
Like the Royale with Cheese discussion usually gets the that's the example people go to when it's like, oh, Vincent and Jules are just going to work like anybody else.
And this
Um,
one even answers the question like, what did they do leading up to it? They just go out to breakfast.
yeah. And while they're there, it still continues. They just talk about random shit that's anything but the job.
Hmm.
In this particular case, or cases, I guess you could say, we get from Madonna to tipping,
Hmm.
which
Let's not forget there's a little bit of a hidden foreshadowing in that scene.
yeah.
Whenever Joe asks who didn't tip, and Orange rats him out immediately.
Which is, I love that you can see it as like, whoa, that's clever foreshadowing. I also think it's hilarious in a good way. Because it's a Mr. Pig, just completely instantly. And he continues to do it. He keeps talking. He's like, oh, because he doesn't believe in tipping, to the point that Joe actually has to tell him to shut up.
Yeah.
And that's we'll actually get into that in the next movie also, with characters whose main trait is they just continuously talk.
See, like, I think of the phrase throwing under the bus, and like that phrase comes up a lot. And I feel like that Mr. Orange picked up the bus and beat Mr. Pink to death with it in that scene.
And it's funny to see the contrast of, these are people where if you turn on them in a big way, you'll be killed for it. And it's like the fact that we have such this small version of that, where the only consequence is put your fucking dollar in and shut up.
Hmm.
And then we see the much more horrible consequences of when that is a bigger issue as the movie goes on. What, given the fact that this, even though it's not by Joe's hand, or a consequence of being the cop specifically, that the person that can't seem to stop talking in the opening scene is now bleeding to death for the entire rest of the movie after that. And what do you think of that cut? Where it's that whole thing we were talking about, where there's such kind of a calm, where it's like it's just people hanging out before they go to work, and then as we're getting to the end of the opening titles, we're now seeing the aftermath with Orange, and it's pretty terrifying.
Well, let's not forget too that essentially the opening credits is a hero shot.
Yeah. and that goes further when they're talking about, I think it's around the time Mr. Blonde first gets there, and Mr. Pink's trying to get everybody to calm down, and he says, we just got to figure out who the bad guy is. And it's like, I love how just naturally that comes out of his mouth, when the bad guys in this case he's talking about would be the heroes in any other story.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the way the movie gets inside the mind of a criminal or criminals is what makes it so intriguing. And especially kind of gives you that idea with having such an enclosed setting most of the time. Like do you feel like the whole warehouse setting by itself could pretty much be a play?
Yeah.
I actually think if you look on YouTube, there might be like amateur productions of something like that.
I think too, with the smaller setting like that, the more intimate setting, it allows the paranoia to feel bigger.
Yeah. It's almost like it kind of gives you like the old Hitchcock vibes, like Rope or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's and in some of those cases where the camera just kind of sits there for a while, like when it focuses on, like when we're kind of looking when towards the beginning, like right at the beginning, when Mr. White and Mr. Pink go into that other room and the camera just kind of stays at the end of the hallway,
Mm-hmm.
and we're only looking at Mr. White as they have a conversation. And we get moments like when Mr. White says, "Are you calm?" And we hear Mr. Pink seemingly throw something or push something over or something, and then we hear, "Yeah, I'm calm," after. He throws some sort of tantrum that's really brief. What do you think of Buscemi in this?
I think he's great.
The thing I really love about Buscemi, and I don't know if he was always this way. I would assume so, I guess, because I can see quite a bit of. Well, I guess you need to look at it the reverse. I see quite a bit of Mr. Pink in Carl Showalter in Fargo.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like between Reservoir Dogs and Fargo, you kind of get a vibe that Buscemi's so good at that kind of character to the point that you'd almost wonder if he's like that in real life.
But then I love when you have something like The Big Lebowski, where he's the total opposite.
Yeah, in real life, he's more like Donnie.
Mm-hmm.
He's like really, he kind of comes off like really timid in real life. and it makes performances like this so much more interesting when you know that. I also there were a couple of things actually we didn't mention in the opening scene, the breakfast scene, when something I think is really interesting is Mr. White's dynamic with Joe, where Joe's obviously the big like head of the whole thing, as we talked about, but yet you get that sense of when he finds like that old address book he's trying to go through, and Mr. White like scolds him for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it really kind of, it makes the characters feel so lived in that Joe is that big of a figure, but Mr. White is clearly this comfortable with him that he's like yelling at his dangerous boss over an address book. And he's to the point that he actually takes it away from him and refuses to give it back to him because he won't shut up. And it's like when we see the Joe that we see later, it's like Mr. White is very comfortable with him. Like it's clear they've been doing this together for a long ass time.
Mm-hmm.
And just things like that can take the character work really far without even having to go into that kind of thing. Because we get a lot of Blonde's history with them, but really the only thing we get through, like we get a lot of Blonde's history with them through exposition, and White we don't really get much any exposition with his background with Joe. It's just we just kind of see it when they interact. Do you remember when we saw this in the theater back in 2012 when it was having its anniversary?
Mm-hmm.
And we were early, but they also accidentally started the movie early.
Mm-hmm.
So they had like that 20 minutes of like behind the scenes stuff or like interviews, and then it played the opening scene, the breakfast scene. And then they shut the projector off because it started too early. And they said, yeah, sorry, but because of just the whole thing, like because of protocol, we just have to start it all over again. So we had to watch the 20-minute behind the scenes thing and the opening diner scene all over again. It was like it kind of made it more worth the price that we got the diner scene twice. Do you notice?
I think what really is neat about the diner scene too is it's very good at establishing who the characters are and what they're like without bogging you down with exposition.
Yeah, especially the ones we barely know.
Mm-hmm.
Like we were talking about how Tarantino gives himself all the whole Madonna monologue, and it's like, oh well, that seems pretty arrogant of him. But then that's pretty much all Mr. Brown gets. he gets that's a little too close to Mr. Shit, and then his death scene.
Mm-hmm. Which that's another, I think what also makes that work is the scene where they give the names in the diner scene. It does make you wish that you had more scenes of them all being together because it is fun to watch them feed off each other.
Yeah, it's almost surreal, especially when you look at this will be a great time to praise something I love to do that I don't get enough of a chance to do is praise Harvey Keitel's performance in this.
Mm-hmm.
Is like when you see the contrast of when Mr. White's on a job versus how he is in his normal life. It's like he's playing two different characters. Like the guy that says let's go get a taco versus
Mm-hmm.
the guy that's fighting with Mr. Pink after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
It's like these are characters from two totally different planets. And it's like it really shows just kind of the long-seated professionalism that he has in him. And it's I can't really praise that enough. And also the fact that we've been talking about how Mr. White seems on such even ground as Joe, even though Joe's his superior. But the second we see the scene when they're all laughing in the car, talking about, that TV show and whether or not Pam Grier was in it and stuff like that, and they're laughing and giggling like children. And Joe brings this up almost verbatim.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly when Joe scolds them, Mr. White just seems like one of the kids. And it's like there's so much going on here with Mr. White that Harvey Keitel does so perfectly in all of those facets that I just can't praise enough. And the fact that not only did he help significantly get the movie off the ground, but that he contributed such a performance as that to it as well. Like Harvey Keitel is forever Tarantino's guardian angel.
Without Harvey Keitel, we probably wouldn't have Rick Dalton.
Yeah, it's like it was so great when this past Oscars happened, and Tarantino was there with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and Harvey Keitel was there because of The Irishman. And it's like just to see them in the same place again, just felt so like right.
Mm-hmm.
So and yeah, I kind of wanted to go just a little bit more into the cut we get of Orange in the back seat after the opening credits, because
I also, before you go on, I also love the fact that they apparently stayed so close that Harvey Keitel stuck around to do a cameo as a voice on the radio in Bastards.
yeah, it makes you like strive for more. Not I mean, obviously we would always strive for him in another Tarantino movie, but it's like even a cameo in one would work.
Mm-hmm. I kind of feel like, do you kind of feel like, and this might be kind of a strange comparison, but do you kind of feel like that Kurt Russell has kind of become Tarantino's new Harvey Keitel?
Oh, you mean like imagining Harvey Keitel playing John Ruth in the 90s?
Yeah, or Stuntman Mike.
Oh man, '70s Harvey Keitel would have been an amazing stuntman. Mike. Yeah, I can kind of see it, and I can see him the way like the way Randy in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood scolds Rick over Cliff. I could see
Mhm.
him kind of being that sort of almost like an authority figure, where it's just
I
like
can't I
he has
can't
to deal with
see I
everybody's
can't see
bullshit.
him saying the line "I don't dig him" though as well as Kurt Russell does.
I feel like I feel like he says a similar line in Taxi Driver, if I'm not mistaken. I could be imagining that. I mean, that is interesting to think about how Tarantino's regulars have kind of morphed over time,
Mhm.
and then some people always come back, like Tim Roth. Do you do you think it would have been, given the circumstances? Do you think it would have been possible to overplay Mr. Orange?
Yeah.
Because I feel like you could possibly take that route in the scenes where he's like really freaking out. But I feel like this opening scene establishes that so well. Where, like I said, that the way they kind of just push you into it, and we just cut to it abruptly. And at the time, if you're seeing it for the first time, you're disoriented as to what the hell's even happened.
Mhm.
And he's saying stuff like, I mean, yeah, a guy's been shot, he's going to be screaming because of pain, most likely. But the fact that, like, he draws attention to the fact that the thing that's freaking him out is seeing all the blood, and then saying things like, I can't believe he notice he's pretty much already accepted a horrible fate, and that's how, like, where his mind is at when he doesn't say I can't believe she shot me. He says I can't believe she killed me.
Mhm.
And it's like stuff like that makes the scene really terrifying and kind of puts you in the mindset of somebody that has been shot and is bleeding out that much.
Especially the fact that when you're doing that, the last thing he probably expected was to be shot by a civilian.
Yeah. And it's like there, and it's especially the moment when we actually see it happen, and he just has that one look, and it's like it's shock that that's what happened and that's how it happened, and then there's also the remorse that comes with it,
Mhm.
and it's like, and it kind of just also is the kind of like the, because you can say, like, when Mr. Blonde started shooting everybody could be when it all went south. You could say when the cops showed up is when it all went south. And when shootouts started happening is when it went south. And it was that moment for Mr. Orange where it was like, this is how bad it got, was my interaction with this civilian I've just killed, and who has probably inadvertently killed me. And then there's also the stuff like, we were talking about some of the clues to him being the cop. There's also the scene when Eddie's in the car on the phone, and there's the orange balloon and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Um, there's what's interesting when I was talking about the dynamic when Mr. Pink is talking about the cops being the bad guys, and how that hearing him say that almost just without us even registering it puts us in the mindset that they are somehow the heroes of this story. But it's still always in your mind that these are criminals, many of which are quite insane. But there is like a tragedy that's looming over this movie. Like when it's all said and done and when it's over, it feels like a tragedy. And one of the things about that was when at the beginning, right when they first get to the warehouse, and Orange is begging to be taken to a hospital, and he says, fuck jail, just I need to fix this. I need to not die. But the conflict is the fact that if Mr. Orange is, because he says to Larry, just drop me off, just leave me there. And of course, the problem is that Larry's under the impression, but you'll be arrested. No, we can do something better than that. We can do this without the cops getting involved. And it's like, Orange is the cop. Orange is the cop. If he goes to the hospital and gets taken care of, he'll be fine.
Mhm.
Like if he had just done the thing where if Larry had just done the, oh, it'll be against my conscience, but okay, fine, I'll drop you off at a hospital. He probably, are we under the impression he probably could have made it?
I think everybody would have lived.
Yeah. Well, it's hard, I guess it's hard to say what would have happened once Joe did show up at the warehouse, since that's what the cops were waiting on.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. So yeah, because the way Mr. Blonde went out would have probably been different. That is almost a whole thing you want to go into with all the stuff we know. What would have been the chain of events if you took Mr. Orange out of the equation?
Mm-hmm.
Because Blonde still had the cop, and he had made it clear he had planned on torturing that cop for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. Do you think? I've always wondered if, like, what kind of chain of events we would have needed for Mr. Pink to just leave, because Mr. Pink kept saying, I feel like the warehouse is like a hot spot.
Mm-hmm.
We probably shouldn't be here. It's like I feel like Mr. Pink was always on his way out the door, but and as we eventually see in the very last scene, actually while we're there, what are you under the impression is Mr. Pink's fate?
I don't know how he would have got away with all the cops out there.
Yeah, because people have mentioned, and I've heard over and over again, that you can hear him being arrested outside. I've heard you can hear him being gunned down outside.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard you can hear him say, "Stop shooting, I've been hit." But I've never really, as many times as I've seen the thing and as high as I've had the volume, I've never quite heard much of any of this. You hear them arriving, and I want to say you hear maybe some faint gunshots, but I don't know. There's also, I think there's a YouTube video out there that like really, really heightens and cleans up the sound to where you can hear him saying something like "I've been shot" or something like that. But I've never known for sure, no matter how many times I've seen it.
My guess is he got caught, took a deal to implicate everybody, even though they were all dead, and now he works as a waiter at Jack Rabbit Slim's. And that's why he has no personality.
And conveniently in character as another person. And he's gonna start appreciating tipping more because he's a waiter now. So where does that put us now? Yes, there's somebody we haven't talked about yet in detail. We have to go into Mr. Blonde. There's so much to unpack here. So we already talked about how he's got the history with Joe and Eddie and all that, which we see in those scenes that are still, I mentioned exposition is how we get there, but they're still illustrated well too. Especially when you see like how when he's in the room with Joe, it's all business and he's trying to be respectful, but then the second Eddie comes into the room, they're like brothers wrestling on the floor. And
if I remember right, they get scolded.
Yeah, they're throwing gay jokes at each other, and it's this really sort of father and brother relationship between the three of them. And we get the whole history of how Blonde never ratted on them and stuff like that. What I find really interesting is how often do we get a character structured the way we see Mr. Blonde? Because we eventually get, some humanity in him, as much humanity as we're going to see out of him in this scene where we see him with somebody that's like a father to him and like a brother to him, as the Cabots are. But before that,
to the point where when it's brought up that Blonde could be the rat, Nice Guy Eddie is straight up offended.
Yeah, like that's probably what propelled the climax into what happens. That was probably the starting point. Because that Nice Guy Eddie was ready to kill somebody as soon as he saw Blonde's body. And then when Orange tried to fabricate this story that Blonde was going to kill everybody else, it's the dynamite had been lit.
Yeah. And Nice Guy Eddie saw right through that bullshit.
So going way back.
He was the Ron Burgundy gif of, I don't believe you.
Yeah. So going way back, what's interesting is Blonde's in the diner scene where everybody's acting normal, everybody's having conversation. He's not saying much. We get one clue that he might be a loose cannon when Joe says, "I've changed my mind, shoot this guy," and they're all joking, and he does like the shooting gesture, which is just some serious foreshadowing. But you're like, oh, he's one of the guys. They're all part of the group. They're all the guys or whatever. But then once we get to the warehouse, we start hearing about what happened with Mr. Blonde. How he went fucking insane. Like, you wouldn't believe how insane he went. He started shooting people left and right. He is like, Mr. White cannot believe that Joe would hire this guy. This guy that we were talking about the comfort level he's at with Joe. Like, he's almost feels like equals to Joe. And his response is, how could Joe work with such a psychopath? I have no idea.
Mr. Blonde shows up with a fucking beverage.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of another example where a character is so built up to off screen after we've already met them once. But yet it happens so effectively.
I don't know if it's just because I watched it recently, but I feel like you could almost put Frank Costello in that category.
I could see that, though Costello has quite a bit of screen time. Like, we do continuously cut back to him, but he does also have a lot of build up in the scenes where he's off screen.
I mean, Kevin Corrigan refers to him as God.
Yeah.
God says, as far as you're concerned.
But that's the thing is, he's reintroduced just when Mr. White and Mr. Pink are at the peak of their tension. Because I love the way this scene builds between them, where we have Mr. Pink's flashback in between, but it's still built up perfectly, like there's no break. When we start off and it's like, they're all like, Mr. Pink comes in screaming. as you would expect him to. But then there's a calmness when he's trying to get Mr. White on the same page as him about there's a rat and stuff like that. And then, they share cigarettes and stuff like that. He gives him one of his Chesterfields, and it's a nice moment where he says, hey, splash water on your face. And it's like they calm each other down well. And then this somehow escalates to them pulling their guns on each other. And it's like, this tension has built.
It's funny, too, how Mr. Pink comes in with so much panic. But then for a good majority of the movie, he's the most level-headed one.
Yeah. He's the one trying to diffuse everything.
He's the one that comes in, guns blazes, screaming. And then an hour later, he's calling for everybody to remain fucking professionals.
Yeah. But then, like, just as this tension reaches its peak, and as, like, the camera's pulling back, it's like suddenly that, of all times, is when we're reintroduced to Blonde. And the thing about this moment that's so great is the fact that with everything that's been built up now, we've been highly anticipating Mr. Blonde coming back. Because there is that time where they're not even sure what happened to him. And it's like, it turns out that not only he had time to take a cop hostage and stop for fast food before he came to the warehouse very calmly. and he's the most insane of all of them. And I just really fucking love that character. Like Mr. Blonde is probably one of my favorite Tarantino characters, and you obviously can imagine how high that bar is.
Yeah.
So and I think a lot of that has to do with just how, like I said, just the build up to him when we just kind of get just because he doesn't say much at the diner, does he? If I'm remembering correctly.
No, he's pretty quiet.
And he almost looks like he'd just be kind of like the cool one of the group. Like a silent Fonzie of the group or something.
He shows up to the warehouse in fucking sunglasses.
Yeah, and it's totally day. Not only is it daytime, it's a pretty bright fucking day.
Mm-hmm.
And then inside is the contrast of how everything looks like dark and it's like everything's in like shadows and shit. And still. And he just But the thing here is that once we get to like the torture scene, I guess before we go into the torture scene, one thing to mention is do you obviously the stuck in the middle with you scene is one of the most not only is it probably one of the more famous uses of music in movies in general, like pre-existing music, but the idea of music, a song choice contrasting with what the scene is.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as like that whole the darkness that I was kind of talking about, like actually becomes the longer we're in the warehouse, the darker the movie becomes. It's kind of the direction I was trying to go earlier, but I kind of like I had that and it sounded right in my head, and then I kind of crumbled. But this is pretty much what I mean. As things escalate and escalate. But talking about stuck in the middle with you, obviously the story is that Tarantino wanted Ballroom Blitz, but couldn't get the rights because Wayne's World had it. I don't know about you, but it's probably just because we know the scene so well at this point. I can't imagine Ballroom Blitz in that scene. I almost feel like it's
of a song for what's going on.
Yeah. It's like the way Mr. Blonde just kind of like slowly grooves to it is what's so ominous about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I can see if like in Tarantino's mind at the start, Ballroom Blitz would have made the scene more tense as the song kind of gets faster as it goes, especially into the chorus. I guess, like I said, I guess just because we've seen the scene as it is, and it made movie history that way by itself, it's just impossible to imagine now the like a faster song in that scene.
Mm-hmm.
And it would have felt and sounded more fitting. Whereas with Stuck in the Middle with you have the contrast. So that's yeah. And then obviously that whole thing, the Tarantino trademark, or what used to be the Tarantino trademark, not so much anymore, was the implied violence, where it got to the point to where like when things happen in the older Tarantino movies where we don't see the graphic scene, we just see the aftermath, but it's done so well that people leave the movie under the impression they saw all the violence when they really didn't see much of any of it.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre effect.
Yeah. And I was saying, once Kill Bill came along and everything after that, like, you know, Kill Bill and Django and The Hateful Eight and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, his violence definitely got more screen time. But yeah, the thing where like the ear scene became like infamous because people thought it was so shocking and graphic. And I mean, it is graphic when you see him holding the ear and you see like the hole in his head.
Mm-hmm.
But people like left theaters in 1992 telling people they saw a guy get his ear cut off when they didn't. And that's just how effective it is. So speaking of The Hateful Eight, did you the moment, it only happens once, but that moment when they're in the warehouse and they're all talking, and we have that view of the front, and the door just kind of creaks open by itself, and Mr. White has to walk all the way across the room and shut it. Doesn't that feel like a precursor to the door in The Hateful Eight?
Yeah.
There is another thing here that I really like that's just kind of here in the background is the use of Stephen Wright as the DJ.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, just something I love. It kind of reminds me of another Steve Buscemi movie, Mystery Train, the Jim Jarmusch movie. And there's a DJ role that's kind of that same way where we just kind of hear him throughout the movie. And in Mystery Train, it's Tom Waits, which is as perfect as it sounds. And you I don't know if you would think so, or I mean, obviously Stephen Wright has a very recognizable voice, but I don't know if he would have been my first thought if you had told me about this, the fact that we hear a DJ throughout this movie. But it is pretty much perfect, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, that's the thing we were talking about with like Stuck in the Middle with You versus Ballroom Blitz, where it's like just things kind of being slow and drawn out in this movie work just as effectively as, not only does it just work as effectively as the scenes that are more heightened, but we're building up to a moment. Like when we talk about those long Tarantino scenes, like the tavern scene in Bastards, where it's like nearly 20 minutes of buildup and the burst of violence is like 10 seconds of that. But yet it's somehow worth it. And it's like this, while there are violent scenes and there are shootouts in it that we see briefly, the whole movie is building up to the one moment where White, Joe, and Eddie all shoot each other, which lasts for, what, 1 second and a half, maybe? But, yeah, one thing we missed was when we go into Orange's backstory. I feel like this is another case where when you see a director debut, there's usually that moment where it occurs to you, this person could be a big deal. It feels like we're seeing a lot more one-hit wonders lately. We had a lot of one-hit wonders kind of in the mid-90s also. But there are also those people where it's like you just have a feeling they're going to go on to something really huge, like maybe create their own genre even. Would you say people watching this for the first time in 1992, when the thought solidified in their mind that the person that made this movie was going to be a big deal, is the bathroom scene with Orange?
I would say so. I think it's also the point where people kind of realized either Tarantino was for them or wasn't.
Yeah. It's like, because it'd be so easy to dismiss it as a gimmick. But there's just something so, still to this day, like that's the thing that always kind of blows my mind when I think about Tarantino extensively, is a lot of the shit he's done still to this day feels so incredibly unique. Where we get this scene of we're in the warehouse, then we get the flashback to Orange, who's preparing for this assignment, and then that goes into the whole thing of him meeting Joe, White, and Eddie at the bar, and his first assignment here is to tell them this fictional story to convince them that he's supposedly legit. But to take that a step further and show us the fake story, I mean, that had to have been the moment, like to 1992 audiences that were like, whoever made this is going to be sticking around. And the fact that you can still see that in some, like the scene with the Rebecca Gayheart scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where she plays Cliff's wife when they're on the boat, and he may or may not have killed her, is a flashback within the flashback that's already happening. And it's like that kind of brought back memories of this bathroom scene. And it's like, do you even... And like I said, the fact that he was able to do that without making it feel like just a gimmick, to even go as far as to have that shot of Roth speaking the story while he's in the bathroom, as he's telling it to Joe and Eddie and White. And I don't even know how to address that other than to address it. But it's still incredible, regardless of how this movie will be 30 next year. And which is crazy because it was the 20th anniversary when we saw it in the theater.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't feel like that was that long ago. Because it was like right before Django came out. I think it was that December, wasn't it?
I believe so, yeah.
And then Django came out at Christmas. So anything else you want to say about, I guess, either Roth or Orange's story in general? Orange's portion of the movie, not necessarily his story that he's telling, but either.
Do you ever wonder how different the movie would have felt if we never found out who the rat was?
I wonder how that would. Well, yeah, probably the big theory would probably be that it was Pink, because he's the only one that got out, and he was the one that was ultra paranoid from the get-go. If I had to imagine, I'd say that's probably what would have happened. People would have just have assumed that.
What do you think would have been a more impactful ending if it was different than what we got? If we never found out there was a rat, or if we found out for sure that there just wasn't one?
That'd be interesting. And it was all for nothing.
Yeah.
That'd be wild. I feel like there's a famous ending like that, and it's on the tip of my tongue, and I can't think of it. But yeah, as far as this goes, that would be, because I mean, it's hard to say because the ending's so perfect as it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like you would reject any other ending except the one we got. But this is something interesting to think about, I think.
Like imagine you had this movie and you took out the backstories and it was just them in the warehouse trying to figure it out, and you find out at the end that there wasn't one. See, I wonder too if the way that these characters are addressed and built up and the way we know them, which the backstories help with, so this would probably change the dynamic a little bit, but would it have almost like a Night of the Living Dead type ending where it felt like they went through all that for nothing?
Yeah.
And it turns out like an off-duty cop or something just happened to walk by and see it happening, and it wasn't the fact that they were sold out.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm trying to think of how they'd reveal that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just through some random coincidence shown in a flashback.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's anything to talking about heroes and villains and how Mr. Pink officially labels the cops as the bad guys? Do you think there's something to the fact that Mr. Orange has a fixation on comic book heroes, apparently? From like we see his posters on the walls, and then his perfect analogy of referring to Joe as the thing. It's like that. That's one of those lines where I wonder if it was written before or after Lawrence Tierney was officially cast.
Makes me kind of wonder if Lawrence Tierney was like those characters, what he thought of the line. Like if he stood at the premiere and Orange says that, and in the middle of the theater, you just hear Lawrence Tierney go, "Now wait a minute."
So is that pretty much the movie?
I think so. I think we can press forward.
Say I'm not sure there's anything we didn't touch on. So yeah, maybe maybe if there's something we missed, I caught it in the other video, but I have no memory of any of those other ones I did. So, so what are your overall feelings on The Usual Suspects as of about a year ago when you last saw it?
It's definitely a good mystery.
I was trying to figure out if we should talk about the ending first or last.
It's so hard to find a movie anymore that keeps you guessing all the way to the end.
Yeah.
There's a lot of movies that have tried, but like even when we were talking about, like when I saw the Charlie's Angels trailer and I was like, Elizabeth Banks is the villain.
It was Patrick Stewart.
Mm-hmm.
When you are to get there, you had correctly guessed Patrick Stewart as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's so many things that you can. I guess that's another reason I stopped watching trailers. Is there's so many twists that can be guessed just based on context that you see in trailers.
Mm-hmm.
But I still wonder. I mean, as far as I've heard, there are still people who go into this movie blind today and cannot guess the twist.
I saw one of my favorite stories about this movie is that Gabriel Byrne didn't know that he was Kaiser Soze until he watched the whole movie.
He thought he was until he saw the movie. And I think I heard he even argued with Singer about it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like I'm trying to figure out if he didn't know it was verbal. I'm trying to figure out what the script looked like, or at least what the script looked like to them, because the script the movie makes it pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
Or as clear as it can be. I guess there's still the whole thing of what's made up about Kaiser Soze and what's real, which you could do with the whole movie as well, because people kind of go. I guess we're going to go into the ending first. I guess that answers the question. Because, well, I guess it's important to talk about the ending first, because there's the whole debate of people that don't like this movie don't like it because it turns out basically the whole thing is pointless.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it's whether you see that as a good or bad thing. I mean,
well, obviously it doesn't bother me since I suggested that as an ending for Reservoir Dogs.
Yeah, and it didn't bother the Academy because Kristen McQuarrie won for original screenplay.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole idea of people kind of automatically take the ending as everything we saw was made up. Like nothing that we saw happened. So I feel like that's a little bit more open than that suggests. Because we do see like when he saw the name Redfoot on the wall, we don't know if he just had to make up another name for this character, or if the entirety of the Redfoot character and everything he was made up.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing is really confirmed on what exactly he fabricated and what actually happened, because I feel like we can safely say that anything that happens in the opening up until Verbal's interrogation is meant to be legit, because the only thing that's fabricated is everything we're getting strictly from Verbal.
Mm-hmm.
So everything from when the interrogation starts to when the interrogation ends is where everything could be nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Or something else entirely. And they also throw us that little curveball of Kobayashi apparently seems to be a made-up character because it's on the bottom of the mug, yet he's picked up at the end by P. Possibly.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's supposed to mean anything. I've always taken that as just they were just fucking with us at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Like that was almost like just a laugh from the filmmakers to just say we fucked you so hard, audience. Mm-hmm. I know that's a touchy thing to say in regards to Bryan Singer is going to kind of remain the elephant in the room during this conversation.
Well, it's not just him.
Yeah, but it's a lot easier to dance around Singer than it probably is Spacey in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So And
just to get it out of the way, do you wish that you would have watched this movie before you saw Scary Movie?
I actually do want to talk about that because we talked about that when we talked about Scream in our Halloween video,
Mm-hmm.
where Scary Movie is basically a spoiler machine. If you see Scary Movie before you see Scream, or I Know What You Did Last Summer, or of all things, this.
Mm-hmm.
Because Keenan Ivory Wayans was not holding back. Usual Suspect references, Amistad references. Scary Movie has everything. Shakespeare in Love. But the thing that's interesting is, while Scream's ending isn't as effective, for sure, if you've seen Scary Movie, what's interesting is that a Usual Suspect reference in Scary Movie is so out of left field that if you haven't seen The Usual Suspects, you have no idea that it's like that, not just what it's referencing, but that it's referencing anything at all. Like when I saw Scary Movie as a kid, I didn't even really assume that was a reference to something.
Well, not just a reference, it's like an exact replica of the shot they used.
And then what's interesting though is that I think the reason, because I remember, like there are those movie moments that you will always remember forever. Like the first time you saw certain things, everybody is going to remember the first time they saw the end of The Usual Suspects.
Mm-hmm.
And I still feel that way because it was an epiphany moment when I realized, oh shit, that's what they were doing in Scary Movie.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't last because in Scary Movie, it's just Doofy's the killer. And his identity is, completely different. But, which is, of course, the ending of The Usual Suspects. But it's
Not only that, but Doofy gets away.
Yeah. But the thing, though, is that Scary Movie doesn't blow it all the way for The Usual Suspects because the fact that he was gathering everything he was saying from the wall that was in the room is a big enough thing
Mm-hmm.
that it's almost an afterthought, like, oh, yeah, they did this in Scary Movie, but what the fuck? And then the whole thing when it's because it still wasn't entirely, I remember the way it unrolled because it didn't occur to me after I realized, the mug dropping and all that was the thing. But like the shot of when Verbal starts to walk normally is also something Scary Movie did.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't have time. I was so like wrapped up in what was happening. I still wasn't ahead of The Usual Suspects because it was like, oh, he drops the mug and we see the name on the bottom. And it's like, oh yeah, that's the Scary Movie thing. My mind didn't immediately go to, oh, the next shot is going to be the Verbal walks normally. I Verbal walk normally. It was like, holy shit. And then it occurred. Oh yeah, they did that in Scary Movie as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it was such a mind-blowing thing. Even having seen that, it still worked the magic that it was intended to. Like that's how incredible it was pulled off. Do you feel similarly, or did Scary Movie have a bit more of an impact to you, or I guess a lack of impact on this movie to you?
No, I think you're right.
So that alone speaks volumes. Because I guess seeing Scary Movie first kind of really did a number on Scream's twists.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that this is still able to do that, and yeah, like you were talking about, I would like to dissect, before we go into the rest of the movie, I do kind of want to dissect how this movie plays with the audience, where it does that thing where you're talking about where it constantly keeps you guessing. Where it's the thing that would have been really obvious to do is make Keaton the red herring the whole movie.
Mm-hmm.
Like that would have been the really obvious thing. And in a way they do, but in a sneaky enough way that it's not that, like it's, I would say more often than not, people probably watch this movie for the first time, having in the back of their heads, I think it's Keaton. And there's some things that make it seem like maybe it's not Keaton. Then there's other things that say, oh, it's definitely Keaton.
Hell, it had Gabriel Byrne fooled.
Yeah. And it's like they played that perfectly because this is the way the movie would play out. Like, this is the way a good movie would play out if Keaton was Kaiser Soze, or whatever you want to, or the mastermind, we'll just say.
Mm-hmm.
Where they kind of have moments in there to where it's like, oh, he's, maybe it's too obvious that it's him, but then it's like, or maybe it's supposed to be seem like it's too obvious that it's him, so it is actually him. Because we do get sort of parallels to Kaiser Soze and Keaton, because Keaton's whole background is like mythical.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like he was like a cop, and then he was like really big in crime to where he got this huge reputation, and then he got his way out. And there, a lot of people think he's dead, and he like resurrected. And it's like it's its own like mythical story in itself, much like Kaiser Soze has. And then we get scenes like when he meets Redfoot for the first time, and we see just how, because when we see Keaton with Edie Finneran, and we get those scenes where you can tell, or we're supposed to be able to tell, it gets so blurry by the end there. When we have the conclusion that Chaz Palminteri comes to versus what we kind of learn, there's still some gray areas here on information. So it's like, was Keaton still like totally in it, or had Edie Finneran kind of brought him out of it forever? It's something that I still think is never quite cleared up, because there's still moments when Keaton has just this general sinister quality to him, to where it's kind of always in him. And we get those moments when he meets Redfoot for the first time, like I was talking about, where they're talking about that guy that they knew, that mutual acquaintance or whatever, and Keaton just so casually drops to Redfoot, yeah, I killed that guy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I just wanted you to know. Like, I wanted you to know from me before anybody else told you. And it's like, as far as what we know about him, that sounds like a very Kaiser Soze thing to say.
Yeah.
And so when you get moments like that, but there's still always these pieces of doubt, and it carries that so well, it's very easy to see people just automatically going into this movie just kind of thinking that you give them enough to where they feel, the audience feels accomplished, that they think that it's Keaton. Because it's like, usually it's like, oh, this movie's way too obvious, the writing is way too, it's not complex enough, it's so clear it's this person. The people probably going into the ending thinking it's Keaton probably think they've really figured something out. And that's the amazing thing, because I think, I don't know if this was the intention, but I've always kind of felt it that way. It kind of feels like Chaz Palminteri's character Kuyon is basically the audience.
Mm-hmm.
Where like when he's kind of asking all the questions, but he's got it in the back of his head the whole time, it's Keaton. Like, I really think it's Keaton, and he's trying to piece everything together to fit his narrative that it's Keaton, which is what an audience does when they're watching a mystery. If they got it in the back of their head of who they think it is, they try to piece all the things together in the story to fit that, because that's how they'll ultimately be right. And that's exactly what Chaz Palminteri's character is doing through the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of Dan Hedaya in there as well, and Giancarlo Esposito. The cast is stacked.
And not only that, but like the way that Keaton is represented in the movie, he comes across as a leader.
Yeah.
Like somebody that would head up something like that.
Yeah. Is Gabriel Byrne just the perfect casting?
It might be.
Yeah, everybody is.
His casting and his performance might be just as important to the twist as the writing.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's almost like he seemed upset that he wasn't Kaiser Soze, but it's like, it's kind of something to be proud of that he had so many people fooled, including himself.
Yeah.
Because like I was saying, I haven't shown this movie to many people, but I've heard about people who are recounting the first time they saw it. And almost everybody just thinks it's Keaton the whole time. And it's like, and there'll be some of those people, because there's other cases where they especially do this with verbal, but they like really overpower you with stuff that they give you just like, they bombard you with stuff saying it's totally not verbal. Like, dude, like we see, Kaiser Soze light a lighter in the opening scene, and then shortly after, we literally get a scene of Verbal not able to light a lighter.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, anybody would think, is that just, the character building to show, oh yeah, it's definitely not him, of course? Or is it like, that's totally what they want us to think? That seems way too blatant in retrospect. There's so many things that seem so blatant in retrospect, and we never pick up on it the first time.
Mm-hmm.
There's also one thing I noticed that's really great. Once again, I'm not sure how much intention was behind this or not, but they are able to, because not only is the movie well written, but a lot of the specific lines are great. And what's really great is some of the lines are so great that their greatness continues to hide the twist. Because there's the moment at the end, the scene that I'm pretty sure Spacey got his Oscar for, when he kind of breaks down and Kuyan's like right in his face, like like having the big Keaton revelation of, because of this and because of this and because of this and because of this, it's Keaton. All of this adds up to Keaton. And it's like, and Keaton was just using you. And then Verbal's like really small in this scene, and he's like on the floor and everything. And he has that great line where he says, how do you shoot the devil in the back? And then he shows his crippled hand and says, what if you miss? And it's like, that's such a great line that's when people fully accept that Verbal is Verbal. And it's like, it's once you reach that moment, on top of this Keaton revelation, that the audience is just like 100% done. Like, it's Keaton, the end.
Mm-hmm.
When he shows his hand like that, saying, I can't shoot, what if I miss? He's showing his left hand. But when he kills Saul in the parking garage, he's shooting with his right hand. The clue is right there. There's so many things that like add up here, and they're right in your face. But because it's so well written and things are placed right where they're placed, the audience just never sees it. And it's like, is that a fair assumption that people are too distracted by how good the line "what if you miss" is, that they're not looking for clues at that point? It's like, not only is the whole thing well written, you distracted the audience with more good dialogue. And then there's the whole thing also talking about how I feel like that's the scene Spacey won his Oscar for, assuming many voters only saw the movie once. What do you say about Spacey's performance when you know everything? And it's constantly a double-sided performance. You can see the innocent Verbal when you watch it back, even when you already know, but you can also see the constantly plotting Verbal.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's even that shot. It's one of those things where they just give you all the damn clues, but it's just something you would never think about on your first go around. Before Chaz Palminteri shows up and we just get that shot of Verbal sitting in the office by himself, he's literally staring at everything on the wall, gathering up his bullshit story. We are watching him come up with it, and we just don't notice. Because how? Because who would jump to the conclusion that that's what's happening in that moment? Like, who would? Any audience member that claims to have figured it out in cuts like that their first time watching it is even more full of shit than the whole movie turns out being. So, anything else about the twist in the ending?
No, I think that pretty well covers it.
I mean, really, the only thing I really think there is to cover would just be the cast and how great they are. Because we were talking about how perfectly cast it is, just kind of in general.
Do you find it kind of, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, maybe heartwarming, that when they're doing the lineup scene and they're repeating the line, that whenever Stephen Baldwin says that their laughter is genuine?
Yeah, I had heard the story that always goes around was I think it was Kevin Pollak said that Benicio del Toro was farting, and that's why everybody was laughing. And Benicio del Toro half confirmed that. He said somebody was. He didn't confirm if it was him. But I do also think the laughter does seem to have started when Stephen Baldwin broke character. And it does feel like it kind of breaks you away from the scene when you know the laughter's genuine.
Mm-hmm.
And that but there is still, I don't know, it's still a scene that will just be forever great, regardless. Because it's like, when you think of it, because I had heard that Singer was kind of irate at first before he decided to keep everything in. But then it's like, think about how that scene would have gone if they just all said the line normally. Would that, I mean, the image, of course, is iconic, but would the scene itself have been memorable at all?
Probably not as memorable.
Yeah, I do have to say I absolutely love Spacey's delivery of "Hand me the keys, you fucking cocksucker," because it's so, that's another one of those moments where it's like he looks so guilty in that moment. But don't we learn in the Kobayashi scene that it was Hockney that kind of took part in that or something? Like he had some connection to what that whole truck thing was.
I think.
But it's
and add to that the fact that when Gabriel Byrne says it, he says it like he's just so over being there.
Yeah. Which is so true to character in a scene where everybody's breaking character.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's
Plus,
another thing.
I think it helps too because like it kind of adds to their character that they all laugh because like they're so confident that they're not gonna get hung out to dry on this, that they're just relaxed enough that they would laugh at something like that.
Yeah. And also, apparently, Del Toro did a shitload of improving.
Mm-hmm.
Because apparently, what I keep hearing, and from Del Toro specifically, so it has to be true, that in the actual script, Fenster's barely on the page at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's basically a background character. So pretty much everything we know and love about Fenster was coming strictly from Del Toro.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he even got a Spirit Award nomination for it. And yeah, the way I do think there's a bit of a misconception here where how low Fenster screen time is sometimes exaggerated. Because a lot of people mention it like Fenster dies really, really early.
Mm-hmm.
Even though he is the first to die, but it's still pretty late. Like I think it's just after the hour mark that we lose him. It's when we lose him that the gears are kind of starting to go towards the climax. Because there's the whole thing of, they find Fenster dead. McManus wants payback, so they go after Kobayashi. But just when they're about to kill Kobayashi, he says, "Oh no, I'm actually in with Edie Finneran," and that keeps Keaton from doing that. And they say, "All right, fine. I guess we have to do this fucking job then." And then that's the climax. It's really not that far off.
Mm-hmm.
But talking about,
it's funny too because it also kind of plays on an old trope where a major character dies early and ends up being more important than you thought. And with Fenster, that's not the case.
Yeah. And I
feel like if this movie were made today, there's a very good chance that Fenster would have been Kaiser Soze and it would have been a twist.
Yeah, there's so many different scenarios you can imagine in this movie that would have made it so much shittier.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why it's amazing how well it turned out.
Mm-hmm.
But just to bask in some Fenster, I really wish I knew exactly which lines were his and which were in the script. But I've heard most of Fenster is improv.
Mm-hmm.
I think of scenes like when they're in the jail cell after they've been interrogated, when he just says the line, "I had a man's finger in my asshole tonight." And there's moments that feel so unscripted. Like I feel like the moments that feel unscripted have to genuinely be like the moment when he lays down and he says, "So who in the goddamn piss hell stole that fucking truck?" Mm-hmm. And Kevin Pollak off screen goes, "What?" And that moment in the lineup scene when he just kind of mumbles the line and they say in English, he's like he says the whole "excuse me." Like that kind of stuff has to be improv. And the whole when he says the line begrudgingly and then does that "what the fuck," that's when you can tell again that the laughter's genuine.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's what made Fenster so amazing, is he was pretty much doing all the work for the character. But if you just watch the performance, you would think Del Toro as an actor just wasn't giving a shit. but he was making the character everything it should have been.
You think he doesn't care, and it's actually this carefully crafted performance.
And then there was also the whole thing where he was just in another spacey movie the year before in Swimming with Sharks. He played Rex, the really flamboyant guy that shows Frank Whaley around the office.
Mm-hmm.
And I had heard, I think this is on the commentary, he said that when he played Rex in Swimming with Sharks, the director got on his case and said that he was doing the part too feminine and too flamboyant.
Mm-hmm.
So when he went into Fenster, he was like, I'm going to go super flamboyant. And it's like all those little things ended up making this character so memorable when, by all accounts, he was barely in the script at all.
Mm-hmm.
He said on Stephen Colbert that Fenster died on page 37. And I can't that seems like it's way too early to be accurate, but so I'm wondering if that's actually somehow the case, or if that was just him kind of, it was an exaggerated way of saying he dies early, but not, literally on page 37. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like Fenster's in it a lot longer than people remember, but still, it's the fact that it could have been a nothing character and instead it's this is the beauty of it. I've got do you have anything else on Del Toro?
I think if you had a lesser actor, he would have easily been a character that was just kind of gone, without much of an impact.
It's like, even as a young actor, I think he had that, because you could probably also say that about Dario in License to Kill, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Like, he could have just been another henchman, but there was just something about the way he played that part that made him so memorable and like kind of scary.
Especially the fact that he's essentially a kid.
Yeah, he's what, 21 in License to Kill or something?
Mm-hmm.
Which means he would have still only been in his 20s here. He does look like he has a fucking baby face in this compared to what he looks like now.
Yeah. Now he just looks so seasoned.
But not to say Del Toro's still not, a really fucking good looking dude. But the next thing I wanted to ask you about was it's very interesting in retrospect that this, I mean, obviously the first portion of names is alphabetical, so that's how it came to be, but still, the top billed person for this beloved crime movie is none other than Stephen Baldwin.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about Stephen Baldwin in this movie? He's really good in this, isn't he?
Yeah.
he's really good in this. And I love the fact that Alec Baldwin was the one that warned him about Biodome, and he said, if you do Biodome, it's going to ruin you.
Mm-hmm.
And Biodome was only the year after this. And it's like, just think, if he had taken on just one more thing like this after this, where would he be? Would he still be in, like, Pure Flix land as he is now? Or but
Or
it is
Barney
worth
Rubble to
noting.
Mark Addy's Fred Flintstone.
Oh my God, I forgot about that. Oh God. What's interesting about this is when you hear about, isn't it always fun to hear about actors that turn down movies and fucking hate themselves for it?
Yeah.
Did you hear what was going to happen with McManus?
Mm-mm.
Apparently, Michael Biehn was, I don't know if he was offered it, but he was asked to come in and read for McManus.
Mm-hmm.
And he turned it down because he thought the script was confusing.
Hmm.
Which, credit to Michael Biehn, I could probably get that. If you just like read the script once and it's in script form
Mm-hmm.
and isn't the way we see the movie now, it very well could have been very confusing. But he just went ahead and turned down reading for the part. And apparently that's like one of his biggest career regrets by far, from what I understand. So, and I can see that, but this is just one of those casts where they just work so well, especially together. I can't imagine anybody else with a different face.
Mm-hmm. And I would go out on a limb and say that when the movie was made, of the main cast members, I wouldn't really call any of them huge.
Yeah, especially for 1995.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like we were saying, you look at it now and it's like it just feels like there's faces everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I know, Susie Amos is still Mrs. James Cameron, isn't she?
I think.
There's there's a couple of things I also wanted to mention about Verbal as well that I forgot about. About that idea of making you think something and then not. Where it's like when you talk about, the lighter thing, when like you see him try to open the lighter and it doesn't work out, and it's like, oh, he can't be the guy from the beginning. But then we get that scene where he's just rambling and he talks about how he gets dehydrated and sometimes his piss comes out like snot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, we actually see Carter Soze pissing at the beginning of the movie. And it's like, I mean, not that you want to pay too much attention, but it's a little thick, isn't it? And that's another thing that always leaves you questioning, when is Verbal slipping truths in?
Mm-hmm.
Throughout the whole thing. Because then there's the other thing where that's kind of a continuous thing with Verbal when we first meet him, because it's like, oh, is it him? And it's like, we see the piss and it's like, oh my God, is it him? And then the lighter, it's like, oh no, it can't be him. And there's just that constant back and forth. And you kind of get that same vibe with his name. When we see him in the cell, and he's just kind of sitting there quietly, and he says, my name's Roger, but they call me Verbal because I talk too much. And Hockney makes that sarcastic comment of, yeah, I was just going to tell you to shut up, because Verbal wasn't talking through the whole scene.
Mm-hmm.
So there, you're under the impression that the nickname is ironic. They call him Verbal because he's quiet, much like you'd call a fat guy Slim.
Mm-hmm.
But then later on, we learn, oh no, all he fucking does is talk when given the chance. So this is how he got the name Verbal. So there's always that thing of, oh, is he or isn't he, in pretty much any regard ever through the whole movie. So another person I wanted to touch on was Pete Postlethwaite, of course, who comes in late, but in true Postlethwaite fashion, makes his presence known. Because there is that's kind of a big clue there also about the fabrications here. I may be mistaken, but isn't Kobayashi like a Japanese name?
Mm-hmm.
I suppose in the context, if this were a real character, it could also be like a code name or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to think of it as they were saying it was his real name, and that's just another big ass clue that this isn't true. But then there's that great moment where it's like, when he seems like he's kind of just, the guy that's sent by the main guy. He's just there as almost like a messenger of sorts. He's like, Mr. Soze wanted you to have this, and Mr. Soze wants you to do this and all that. And then it's like, oh, we can easily go after this guy after Fenster gets killed. So they're just like, they find a way to trap him, which is surprisingly easy for who he supposedly works for.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, oh, so this guy isn't much of a threat. But then Pete Postlethwaite, you can really see this in the town. Pete Postlethwaite really had this great way of doing like coldness in that scene where like he goes like really dark, and suddenly he's just kind of calmly saying, still using his business voice, you have family members that most people wouldn't even know about that I can have killed. He goes so far as to say he's going to have a nephew of McManus's castrated.
Hmm.
And it's like, oh, well, this is a really cool character suddenly. So it's and a very threatening character suddenly. And this is just the guy below the guy, supposedly.
Hmm.
That's another thing that would have been really obvious, is to make Kobayashi Kaiser Soze would have been pretty easy to
Yeah.
do. And we've talked about Giancarlo Esposito kind of comes in and out, kind of slowly moving the plot forward as we're getting Kaiser Soze physically identified. I love the moment when the guy with the burns is on the bed and it's right before he starts screaming Kaiser Soze. He's like screaming really important shit. And Giancarlo Esposito's response is, "Shut up, I'm on the phone." And then it's noticed you got the more you watch it, the more you notice just those little things that are like like talking about the fact that everything within the interrogation is a fabrication of sorts, though we don't know quite to the extent. There's also little things in there like how when Verbal's talking at the beginning, he just goes into these random descriptions that don't need anything, that don't need to be in the story, that he's obviously grabbing off the wall, like the Skokie, Illinois thing and the barbershop quartet and all that. He gets real specific about people that we don't care about.
He plays his Stephen King card there.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to throw that criticism at Stephen King, but God, it happens. It happens a lot. There's a moment.
I think the primary example is when he takes 3 pages of The Shining to explain the sound of an arm breaking.
So there's that moment when they're on the boat at the end, and there's a dog there. And as McManus is like creeping through the room with his gun in his hand, he stops and like pets the dog's head and then keeps moving. And it's like, you kind of take that as like, oh, that seems like an interesting thing to throw in there. It's like McManus has a thing for animals or dogs. And then you kind of start thinking about McManus's past life. And it's like, oh, in his childhood, did he have a thing for dogs? And does that continue now? And you can make it a whole character thing. And then you can also look at it as, well, this is still Verbal telling us the story. It's like, I can just see Verbal talking to Chaz Palminteri and just saying, McManus was keeping through. There was a dog there. He really liked dogs. He started petting the dog's head, and it's like just Verbal continuing to over embellish. So this movie is the epitome of that whole thing, where that whole idea of you can tell when somebody's lying the more details they give you. It's something you see a lot with Walter White in Breaking Bad, where like his wife, talking about Giancarlo Esposito, where his wife can tell he's lying the more detail his stories have. It's like that's Verbal in a nutshell, is it not? It's like the whole thing, the whole movie is one of those. But once again, I do like that enough truths sneak in that I feel like you can pick apart forever what may have happened and what didn't. Like, because like there's some cases where, like McManus with the dog, for instance, scenes where Verbal's not around, and it's like, is this stuff that he's telling? Or like the scene when Keaton tells McManus that there's no coke on the boat, and it's like, is Verbal explaining this too, even though he's not there to witness this? But then there's that whole thing of, number one, it's Verbal just making up a whole big story, or you can also see it as, it's been established that Kaiser Soze is like all-seeing all the time. So surely there's something in there. So, yeah. Is there anything else? Oh, it is worth noting, there's something really interesting about this movie and a frequent collaborator of singers in John Ottman, which is something you don't see every day. And he did this for a lot of singers' movies. Were you aware that the editor and the composer of the score are the same person?
No.
Yeah. It's like, you can always kind of see like how that would benefit so well. Of having those two things coming from the same sort of creative mind. And the fact that he and Singer collaborated so frequently. He's the guy that controversially won the editing Oscar for Bohemian Rhapsody. So like I said, something like that, the behind the scenes stuff like that, there's something that's so, like, there's things like that that can be so in tune sometimes in a way that you can't even really explain. But in this particular case, there is an explanation that the music and the editing of the movie itself are coming from the same place. That can make it feel like really, yeah, just like it's all put together in just the perfect way. So, anything else?
No, I think that about covers it.
All right. So, do you have a preference between the two? Because, like I said, if we don't determine that, people get all pissy because we technically call this versus.
Yeah, I mean they're both really good, but I think I'd have to give the nod to Reservoir Dogs.
Yeah, because what's interesting about that is Usual Suspects is one of those movies that you have a reason to constantly come back to it, to see all the different details and how all the different, the ways the writing worked around the audience,
Mm-hmm.
and to see and there's always going to be those little details that you didn't see before, or open up a new door of discussion that you can go into.
Plus, it's one of those movies that I would love to see, like, them take a Clue approach where there's multiple endings where the different ones are Kaiser Soze.
Yeah. I'm picturing the same music playing for each one.
It shows Verbal walking off, and then it just cuts to that screen and it says, "That's how it could have happened."
It absolutely has to end with somebody doing an impression of Michael McKean saying, "I'm going to go home and sleep with my wife."
That would be Chaz Palminteri.
But yeah, obviously, it'd be no surprise for me to say Reservoir Dogs because 9 times out of 10, I pick the Tarantino movie.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, 9.9 times out of 10, I pick the Tarantino movie. But it's also just one that, like, what I was going for was Usual Suspects gives you that reason to keep coming back because the story just suits it. But I've just gone back to Reservoir Dogs so many times, and it's one of those movies that I always forget how much I appreciated until I return to it.
It's definitely one of those, like, when you think of all of Tarantino's great movies, that one doesn't come to mind, but when you watch it, you're like, yeah, this should be up there too.
So it is such a pain in the ass when asked to rank his movies. It's like, I hate being asked to do that. But yeah, so I think that's pretty much the conclusion of this, is it not?
I think so.
Me and you made a whole list of like 20 things we're planning on doing. So we will hopefully be getting to those in the near future. I don't think I want to say what any of them are just yet, but some of them will be things that are being revisited like we've done before, and also some stuff that we've been itching to talk about that we haven't yet, and stuff that we probably never thought we could, but we possibly figured out a way. Some of them are like trilogies, and some of them are franchises and stuff like that, but there's also some random and potentially interesting things, I think, through a vast array of genres. So this should be fun to continue doing. So yeah. So do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that does it. Definitely check out both movies if you haven't, which I feel like these are both movies that most people have checked out.
Yeah. And if you watched this and you hadn't seen The Usual Suspects,
sorry
about that. So I think is that it?
You can say the same thing about, well, no, because Reservoir Dogs, we do get the backstory for Freddy and everything. But yeah, I would say that's it.
All right.